Do you have a morning routine that you do every day? Somebody laughed like that was, like people actually do that. Do you have a nightly routine that you do? I have a every Saturday night routine that I do. I make sure that all of my clothes are ironed and ready to go because I don't set up on Sunday mornings looking like this. I look like a bum most of the time, and so I iron clothes and I bring them and I change in the lovely restrooms here at the school every Sunday. But I have this routine that I go through that I got to get all these things done before I go to bed so that I can relax and my mind can be focused on Sunday morning and the message. Maybe you have routines that you do as making the kids' lunches before they go to school. The night before, you make them, you prep them, and man, Instagram has made like a competition out of this thing. Like what I see kids taking to schools these days, I'm like, my parents are like, here's a Lunchable, take that, you know? But they're like cutting everything up and it's these prepackaged things and it's like perfect and it's like, wow, like they got a charcuterie tray for their lunch. How does that happen for a 3-year-old? And so, but you have all these routines that you do and we work through to make our life a little bit better. Did you know that you can go to Google right now and search habits or routines and you'll find pages and pages of articles to help your life be better and more structured and more organized. If you need that, you may not. If you go to Amazon and you search the word habits or routines, you'll see that they have over 60,000 books available for you to buy on habits and routines. It's a part of our life. We all have things that we need to do every day, part of our normal lives. You have to go to work. You have kids' activities. Your kids are going to school. Now sports are starting to come back for kids, and you're getting involved in that. You have dishes, cooking, and cleaning. And I don't know if, there's a lot of things that we learned throughout COVID. One of the things that we learned in our house is we go through a lot of dishes when we eat at home all the time. Anybody else with us on that one? But there's things that we do, and sometimes we do them so much that we don't even have to think about it. It just becomes a part of our daily lives, and we just make those things happen. It's our routine. It's what we do every single day. If we don't do those daily things and we don't take care of the life that we have, then dishes pile up. You might not smell so great because of your hygiene's not great, or you may have your life as an unorganized mess. Some of you might think that sounds pretty familiar right now, other than the not smelling great part. What would happen in your life if all the daily routines that you have and the things you have to take care of on a daily basis, if you decided one day, I'm only going to do those things one day a week. I'm going to do dishes one day a week, and I'm going to take a shower one day a week. Sounds like a missions trip if you've ever been on a missions trip with a bunch of teenagers. I'm only going to clean up and take the trash out once a week. Our lives would be a mess, wouldn't they? Be pretty stinky around the house, unorganized. Somewhere along the lines of church history, we have bought into the idea that worship was only reserved for a one-day-a-week event, that it was only made for a Sunday morning, 1 hour out of the day, maybe 2 hours if you grew up in a Pentecostal church, but you only have a little bit of time that you actually spend to worship Jesus. Somewhere along the lines that we've reduced it down to just a few moments and a few songs, and we've hired out people like our worship pastors and staff members to make worship happen in our lives, and we've only done them one day a week. If we're not careful, we can compartmentalize worship, and it becomes what we talk about, a check-the-box mentality. That's like, well, I've worshiped this week, and I've given God what I need to give him, and so that's the end of it. I want to read a quote by Paul David Tripp. He says this: worship is not primarily your activity. Worship is first your identity as a human being. Worship is not primarily your activity. Worship is first your identity as a human being. And what happens is that we boil it down to one day a week, but all throughout scriptures there is a call that the essence of our very lives should be a life of worship. One of the things that we have talked about over the last 8 weeks in this series is that we are all worshipful beings. We all worship something. NFL football started this week, and people will worship that, and they will spend time and effort and all these things, and it becomes this God to them. Hunting season is around the corner. I know, please don't kill me, okay? Football season and hunting season, it's like, wow, okay, Derek, you're getting too far. Trust me, I get it. I watched football yesterday and I enjoyed it. It was great to see football, even though your team's not playing, just see something that looks normal. But we have things that we worship, so it's not a matter of if we are worshiping, it's more a matter of who or what we are worshiping. And so if we are made to worship as worshipful beings, if that's why we were made and our identity as a human being is to worship, then it has to start more than just on a Sunday morning. It has to become something that doesn't happen just in an hour on a Sunday morning. It has to become a part of our lives on a daily basis. And part of the culture that we've tried to build here at Collective is that we, even in our mission statement, you'll see the phrase, an everyday follower of Jesus. You see it every Sunday. If you look at it, you walk in, you see the banner. We want you to see that every single day because we want to take the attention off of this moment, this hour every Sunday, although it is important and although it is necessary as a believer to gather with other Christians and to worship. We want to take the attention off of that and say that it's more important what happens on Monday through Saturday than what happens on Sunday morning. So here's the main idea this morning. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. Worship that is reduced to Sundays neglects the call to a life of worship. Worship that is reduced to Sundays neglects the call that is to a life of worship. Now, I want to focus on two ways that we as followers of Jesus can worship in the everyday life. We're going to talk about worshiping in our work. Man, I'm just like I'm doing really good this morning, right? I talked about football season and hunting season, and now I'm talking about enjoying your work. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is worship in our obedience. Worship in our work and worship in our obedience. So let's talk about the first one, worshiping in our work. When I was 16 years old, my dad bought me my first truck, and I was excited until he said, you need to do something to pay for gas. They don't tell you that, right? It's like you buy your car, it's like, yay, I'm so excited. And it's like, but you realize all the places that your parents took you, it took money to do that. And being in this little kind of country area of Florida that I grew up in, that you realize like everybody has trucks, and so you have to have a truck, and it's got a big engine, and it gets 0 gas mileage. And so I got this little job at a hardware store in the part of town that I grew up in was called Ocean Way. That sounds beautiful, right by the ocean, right? It's just a bunch of country people nowhere near the ocean, all right? And so this hardware store called Ocean Way Hardware, the sweetest little lady, had such an impact on me. Her name was Miss Carol, the owner of the hardware store. She's owned it forever, for a long, long time. And I watched this lady do so many things for the community. All she did was own a hardware store, and you think, well, that sounds like a pretty cool job. That's a fun job, but how do we worship in our work? I watched this played out in my life as a young man at 16 years old. Part of my job was really, if you ever worked in a hardware store or something like this, all you do is you try to rig stuff up for people that maybe Home Depot doesn't have the part or they don't sell that part anymore. So they come in with like this pile of stuff and they say, can you help me do this? And so I would do that all day. And in between parts, I would watch this lady named Miss Carol worship while she worked. She didn't walk around playing worship music and singing out and ignoring people. That's not what I mean. I would watch in amazement as people would walk in to buy PVC for a project at their house, and they would come in, they would buy gallons of chlorine for their pool, and they would come up to the counter to where Miss Carol was working the register, and they would start to pour out their lives to this lady. Just an owner of the hardware store. They would start telling them the deep, dark secrets of their lives and what the struggles and the challenges that they're facing, and their marriage is on the rocks, and all these things that they're going through. And I would watch this sweet older lady, sorry, Miss Carol, if you see this later. I'd watch her with so much grace receive what the people are saying, love on them, and care for them, encourage them. And then she'd do something that made such a mark on me. She wore a button-up shirt every time she worked, like this, but it would have like a pocket in it. And she'd pull her little steno notebook out of her pocket, and she'd hold on one second. She'd open it up to like the middle of the book, and she'd say, "Can you tell me that again? I want to write down this prayer request for a second." Here's this sweet older lady that has been working her whole life in a hardware store, but she has learned that only working in a hardware store is not what God had called her to do. That she's worshiping and living out this life that we call the gospel life here in this moment, in the middle of a stinky, smelly hardware store. loving on people that desperately need Jesus. They came to get a piece of pipe or to get chlorine, but she was giving them Jesus the whole time. That's worshiping while we work. Now, chances are most of you in the room are not going to be called to full-time ministry. You're not going to be called to be a pastor or a missionary. It's a little bit easier for me to worship while I work. I can turn on worship music all day and no one tells me anything because I'm the boss. I'm the only person in the office. It's one office, me. And so I can do whatever I want in my office, right? But you may not have that luxury. You may not have that opportunity to do that. So how do you worship as you work? And I would say for you, you may not even be able to do what Miss Carol was able to do. Your job may not be open to hearing people talk about God, and you have to be cautious and careful with what you say and what you do because of the world that we live in now. And so how do you worship with your work? What does it look like? Let's look at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to be in verse 22 in Colossians chapter 3. Very popular passage here, but so good. Verse 22, he says this. It's going to be on the screens as well. It says, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." Bondservants. Now, this passage written by Paul is addressing a bondservant or a slave. Now, this is very difficult to grasp in our minds and understand when we think about that, but it really does, it applies to us as a working class of people, that we have a vocation, we have things that we do, we have a job, we have responsibilities, and people that we work for that are our bosses, they don't own us, but in a sense, there is a lot of parallel to what is going on here. Now, Paul's talking in this whole chapter, he's talking about wives and children and obedience, and he's talking about how to live as a Christian life and a Christian family and a Christian household. And really what we see in our history of America and the slavery that took place there, which is an awful, awful thing that took place and never is to be condoned. But in this sense, in most times, and a lot of times, when we talk about bondservants or slavery in this way, it is these bondservants were considered a part of the family, an extension of the family in most times. But still, there's a darkness right to it that we're talking about bondservants or somebody that owns somebody. Let's look at verse 22. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, you could say those who are your earthly bosses, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So how do we worship while we work? How do we do that? Paul's going to get that into just a moment. But first, Paul starts off with a negative, and he's like, here's what you do not do. Here's what you don't do is if you're going to be obey in everything, yes, you do that, but how do you not do it? It says, don't become people pleasers. This gives a meaning of, are you only working hard when your bosses are watching? Are you only working hard when the people that are your supervisors are watching and paying attention to you? Now, we've all been guilty of this from time to time, I'm sure. There's the old saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play. You remember that saying? And you think when the boss isn't there and it's like all of a sudden all the rules go out the window and it becomes fun. And it's like, wow, this is great. This is fun. And what Paul is saying, he's saying, listen, don't do that. Don't work so that you are seen by your boss. Don't work so that you are seen by people. And so people say, wow, you are such a good worker. He said, no, when nobody's watching and nobody's paying attention to you, you should be working just as hard because you're not working for your boss and you're not working for your supervisor. You're working as worship to the Lord. And when we think of worship, it's like, no, worship is songs and worship is singing. But we have seen throughout the series that it is the whole of our lives, and that includes work. Saying work hard even if your boss isn't watching because you're honoring God with your work, and hard work and diligence is like worship to God. Have you ever thought about work like that? Do you only work hard so that you get a promotion? Do you only work hard so that you get noticed by your superiors, or are you working hard because God says to work hard because it's like worship to him? Not that promotions are bad. Please don't leave here and think like, well, I need to turn that promotion down. I don't need extra money and I'm fine. And that's not what I'm saying. But what is our motivation in our work? In such a goal-oriented life, in a culture where we talk about goals and getting to certain levels and reaching certain amounts of money and doing all these things, and we're chasing, and God's saying, hey, listen, I want you to worship because I want you to work because I created you to be a working being. What's our motivation? What's our motivation in our work? Verse 23. It says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward because you are serving the Lord Christ. Paul tells us in verse 22 what not to do, but he's a little bit more positive, and then he says this in verse 22, and he's like, listen, you should work with all of your heart, work heartily, but not for men. Do it for the Lord. I believe that believers, followers of Jesus, should be some of the hardest working people in our culture. We should be working hard. We should not be seen as lazy or just sitting back and just expecting the blessing of God just to pour out on our life because a TV preacher told us that was going to happen. We should be out there working hard, getting our hands dirty. You might not do work to get your hands dirty, but you get the point, like getting out there and working hard, being a person of work. We should be diligent, owning our responsibilities. That's worshiping God in your work. And I love what verse 24 says, knowing that your inheritance is your reward. Here's the reality is that you may not get paid what you want to get paid, and you may not even get paid what you deserve to get paid. But the shift that we have to have is that we are not working for men's approval. We're not working for a dollar. We are working, yes, to provide for our families, all that. We are working as worship to God. Does that change anybody's perspective in your mind today about work? Listen to what A.W. Tozer says about worship and work. If you cannot worship the Lord in the midst of your responsibilities on Monday, it is not very likely that you are worshiping on Sunday. Whew. We could close and pray right there, right? Because that's exactly what I've been trying to say for the last 15 minutes. If we cannot worship the Lord in the midst of our responsibilities on Monday, it is not very likely that you are worshiping on Sunday. Now, we have the Monday blues, and we think Mondays are the worst, but it's like we're trying to get this attention to ourselves to make this shift in our mind that no, we have the opportunity and the blessing to be able to work. And that's a gift. And in the midst of that, and in the midst of our responsibilities on Monday, we can worship while we do that. So I would just challenge us and encourage us. As Tozer, he says it in a way, and the reason I quote him is because he says things like it slaps you in the face, and I can blame him because he said it. I can still be the nice guy. Worship is the whole of our lives. It's the Monday through the Saturday. It's not buying the lie about worship being in a moment on a Sunday. So what are some practical ways that you can worship? As you work and as you're doing the things that God has called you to do, he's created you to do, how do you work? Or how do you worship while you do that? Here's a couple of things. You can quote scripture in your mind throughout the day. You can have on your phone, lock screen on your phone, you could have your memory verse that you're working through, and you can, every time you pick up your phone, it's the first thing you see. You can quote those throughout the day. If you have a job that you can multitask, you can listen to worship music or podcasts. There's a lot of things. You can have a prayer list that you're working through in the breaks during your work. You can have scriptures that are printed out on little strips of paper and put them on your computer monitor so that as you're working, you can look up and you can see it. There are so many ways that we can worship while we work, but here's the part, is that we need to make sure it's not something that distracts us from our work. We can be spiritual and we can worship, we can sing, and we can quote scripture, but if it gets you fired, then you've not done the right thing. And we need to make sure that we're working hard and we're paying attention, but how can we The challenge for you today is to figure out, how do you worship in the middle of your work? I believe that Christ followers should be known in the workplace as the hardest and most faithful workers and the most honest workers that we can find in our world. Now, I worked in the restaurant business for a little while. Sometimes Christians are not known in the world as being the kindest or the nicest people. If you don't believe me, go get a restaurant job for about 6 months and ask to only work on Sundays. You know where I'm going with that? Sometimes the after-church rush, the after-church crowd, not everybody. They're the most picky people, they're the hardest people to please, and they usually tip the least. And that's not necessarily workplace, but what I'm saying, that the perception that we portray, we have to be careful and pay attention to the lives that we are living, because every part of our life is preaching a sermon. And so are we preaching the right thing? Now, I've been talking a lot about business. A lot about business is the workplace, but what about you stay-at-home moms? What about you moms that are having to figure out what virtual learning looks like? I saw a meme this week of this lady sitting next to her child in front of a computer, and she's sitting out of the screen, but she's got a flip-flop just ready to whip him every time he does something. That's a great picture of what virtual learning looks like right there. The teacher can't see it, but the whole time. You moms working around the house with the kids, I want to encourage you, it's not for nothing. It's not for nothing. You are serving your home. You're serving your family. You're homeschooling your children. You're doing virtual learning. All the challenges that you are facing, it is not in vain. And in turn, here's the shift that I would encourage you to make. In the middle of all that you are worshiping God as you are serving your family. Worship God in our work. Now I want to talk about worshiping God in our obedience. Now I know that most of your kids are probably perfect in this area of obedience, and they listen to the first time that you say something all the time. You never have to correct them, right? Right, kids? What does it do for us as parents? If you are a parent, what does it do for you when your kids obey the first time and you don't have to say it 2 times? It's like, oh, I'm doing something right. This is awesome. I love this parenting thing. And they say it with a yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and you're like, man, I'm going to write a parenting book now because I did it once. But what does it do for you? It brings joy to you, does it not? When your children obey, it's like, wow, it's working. You start to see the progress that takes place, and it fills you up with this sense of pride and joy. And it's like, man, that is so good to see and so good to hear. Now, on a much larger scale, very much larger scale, that must be how it feels to God when his children obey him. Not that God needs our obedience to complete him, because he is God. He lacks nothing. We don't do anything to bring him any glory that he doesn't already have. But don't you get a sense that if we are to obey Christ in our life with the way that we live out our lives, it would bring honor and joy to him to watch his children obey him? Let's look at Romans chapter 12. Flip back just a few chapters there. Verses 1 and 2. That's what he says. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by the testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What a beautiful passage. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, Paul had spent most of Romans talking about the work of Christ and the work of Jesus on the cross, the salvation that he provided for each and every one of us. It's a beautiful book of the Bible. So focused on the salvation work of Christ And so what Paul is about to say is that in light of all that, because you have been saved and because you have been rescued and because you have been brought out of the miry clay and you've been put on a solid rock, which is Jesus, because of all that, I appeal to you. I'm asking you, I'm pleading to you as an apostle, Paul, that is writing with authority and strength and from a place of position. And he says something that would be preposterous to a New Testament believer or a Jew. He says, I want you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, as a first century Jew, that would be radical to say something like that. That they had grown up and in and around the sacrificial system. And he's saying, I want you to be a living sacrifice. It's almost like Paul is like, I'm writing living. I'm going to emphasize living so that you don't go do something crazy and sacrifice yourself on the altar. That's not what I want you to do. We should be a living sacrifice. The life that you are living out is a sacrifice before the Lord. Holy and acceptable. If you know anything or much about the sacrificial system, you know that the sacrifice that was being given had to be perfect and without blemish. You couldn't bring the three-legged lamb up to sacrifice that one because nobody wanted it. It needed to be a sacrifice, right? It needed to cost you something. It needed to be painful in a way to say, wow, this is the best of the best, and I'm going to give it to the Lord. I'm sacrificing so that I can worship the Lord. So how can a sinful being like you and I even be considered holy? Even in our best attempts, we have massive shortcomings, don't we? We have failures and mistakes and disappointments. So how can we, as human beings that have a sinful nature, how can we be holy? We are only able to be holy because of the Holy One that is in us and working in us. There's a distinction here. Sacrifice means that we give up something or forego something. So let's look at verse 2 and see what that is. What do we forego and how do we worship God in our obedience? Our obedience, says verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. There's this shift from verse 1 to 2 from a positive about being this living sacrifice and worshipful. And in verse 2, he's like, and don't do this. Don't be conformed to the world. Don't live like the world. The feeling that Paul is giving us, and that I sense in his writing, is that it's almost like this, we can see the brokenness around us. We can see the depths of darkness that humanity can go to. It doesn't take long to look on news stories and we see all the chaos in our world. That's the sinful nature of humanity. And what Paul is saying, like, you see all that thing, you see how temporal and how fleeting this life is by when people come and go and they die and pass away unexpectedly. It's like, wow. And Paul's saying what a tragedy it is when a person that considers themselves to be a follower of Christ, that they would embrace the world. When we say that phrase world, I'm not saying that don't live in the world and be mission-minded and living out the gospel in front. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't do that. What Paul is saying is that we have embraced the thoughts and the living of the world. What a shame it would be if Christ followers would live that way. Here's a question for you to think in your mind this morning. Are you being shaped by the thoughts of this world, or are you being shaped by the thoughts of God? Think through that. Wrestle with that question. Are you being shaped by the world? Are you being shaped by God? And I will be completely honest and transparent this morning, is that I feel a tension anytime that I talk about obedience. Because the reality is that I have felt this growing up in my life and growing up mostly in church, not mostly, always in church, like every day it felt like. But growing up in church, it can feel legalistic at times. That if you don't obey all the time, then you're a failure and you might need to get saved again because you made one mistake. But there's also a tension of that the pendulum swung for a lot of our culture is that we focus on grace, 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 grace. The Bible says that Jesus was full of grace and truth. He wasn't just truth and he wasn't just grace. He was a perfect mixture of the two. And I think that is the tension that we need to walk in here. I know that my righteousness is as filthy rags, that I can't will myself to make God love me more. I can't earn my salvation through any kind of work of my own, any kind of obedience or any kind of discipline in my life. That I can't do it. But I want you to hear this. Listen to this. When we obey, we don't do it so that we earn more of God's love or earn more of God's favor in our lives. We do it because it's worship to God. In light of what Paul's saying, in light of the salvation that's been provided for you, go out and live it. You've already been saved, so go out there and obey Christ. Do what he's called you to do. Be a light in this dark, dark world, but don't be transformed by the world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And here's the distinction and the key that I think for us to understand is that obedience is not legalism. Obedience is not legalism. It's not legalistic to say that we should obey Christ and want to honor God with our lives. It says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is so important because it's not simply our actions. It's not just willing ourselves to obedience. It's through the renewing of our mind. The implication is that as a follower of Christ, is that we should not think like the world thinks. Now, here's where we have to be really careful. We talk about not thinking like the world. This does not mean that we live our lives in a place of piety, that we say that I am better than everybody else and my life is all together and I'm going to be judgmental towards everybody else that doesn't believe like me. It's not what Paul is saying. He's saying be renewed by the spirit of your minds, the renewing of your minds. We are called to and should live and think differently, but never from a place of pride. Our own brokenness in our lives on a daily basis should be enough to humble us. Amen? So how do we renew our minds? I used to tell the teenagers when I was youth pastor, it doesn't happen by putting your Bible underneath your pillow and sleeping and hoping that it naturally transfers into your brain. Renewing of our minds only happens through uninterrupted time with the Lord, where we spend time in his word. We allow his word to speak to us. We allow the Holy Spirit to speak to our lives and to guide us and shape us and reveal the areas of our lives that we're struggling or we need to be made aware of. For the married folks in the room, sometimes it's just as simple as listening to your spouse, who will see things in us before everybody else sees things in us, which isn't always to hear, is it? But it's necessary. And thank God for godly wives that are willing to do that in our lives. I guess I should say godly wife, not wives. And I love that Paul mentions the mind in this passage. Because what we are doing is not just an emotional connection to where it's mindless action. I heard it said this week is that we don't have to check our intellectualism at the door when we come into church. That we shouldn't have to. We should use our minds. We should be critical thinkers. We should be understanding and growing and learning and knowledge and wisdom. But he's saying renew your minds, not just connect emotionally and come in on a Sunday and you feel the worship music and it's like, this just feels right and I'm going to worship. It's not just emotion, it is intellectual as well. And it's in our minds that we're able to do that. We use it to think on the things of God. And when we let the Spirit renew our minds, then and only then are we able to see what is good and what is acceptable and what is perfect. Are you worshiping God with your obedience? Are you worshiping him in your work? Worship that has reduced to Sundays neglects the call to a life of worship.